Hi there. How are you? Good. So my name's Matthew. I'm here from Volition. We make the Saints Row series of games. I'm a data scientist, which is a funny title because if you ask 100 people what that person does, you will get 100 different answers. To answer you a little bit of a question, I do something between what Leonard does and what everyone else does. And that I used to be an academic and now I've moved to industry. So I'll talk a little bit about that first. My name is Matthew White. I worked at Penn State teaching computer science and a little bit of game design for about the last 5 years. There's a bad joke up on the slide there too. Now I do data science and analytics for Volition, as I said, and I'm part of our small 4-person player research team. We've got an in-house staff, an in-house laboratory, and we have custom telemetry solutions that we've built in-house as well. So what I'll talk about today is a little bit of a retrospective of kind of what we've done at Volition to move from no research at all to the kind of modern research we now do on the Saints Row titles. So Champaign, Illinois, metropolis that it is the headquarters of Volition. It's about a 20,000 to 100,000. It's a 60,000 student town, city in Illinois in the United States. This is in the Midwest, land of tornadoes. You'll have to forgive me, I'm going to drink a lot of water. I am jet lagged and just a mess. And particularly, we are good at making third-person, city-based sandbox games. And we think we do that very well. Here's a bit of history of Volition. We started with the Descent titles, the Descent title, 2 of them, in the 1990s, which made the founders quite a lot of money, which moved us into later series like the Red Faction and Saints Row series, which some of you might have played. We also did the Punisher game on the PlayStation 2, for those of you who played and liked that one. So I've never really believed we should do this, but every time I come to another country to talk about Volition, we do a short video. And the reason for that is it gives you a quick overview of the kind of company that we are if you don't already know. So I'm going to play you this.
The president shooting for the fairway.
For those familiar with blazing from Saints Row 4, this is very similar, except with flight. The goal for Gat is to go through the different waypoints as quickly as he can. This particular area that Gat is going through is the shantytown. It's a lot of very claustrophobic sorts of areas, very run down. This is where the poor bastards, the lost souls and husks of hell live.
It's kind of like, in the beginning of Sleeping Beauty, where there's like the storybook and opens up and it's illuminated text and storybook pages.
And you're seeing the material for the first time. They can't let this stuff out of the room because it is top secret. They'll tell you a little bit about the game, they'll show you some things to inspire you, and then the inspiration is kind of improvisational.
Exertions, pain sounds, combat sounds, most games. It's very cathartic. I enjoy it, but it's a very interesting method to learn.
You have to get your body into it because you can hear all that.
Oh crap, we have fire screams. Those are the best. They're so much fun. Blackbeard fire scream. For the love of God. It's a good abdominal workout at the end of it. It's the new P90X routine.
You don't really think about when you're playing a video game, but as you get a chance to watch these performers work, you can't help but admire what they're able to do. You know, they keep pumping out Saints Row, and as long as they do, I want to be a part of it.
The first time that I saw a game I actually worked on was definitely an awesome moment.
We have a bunch of really dedicated, creative people who want to make great games, and they will stop at nothing to do that.
If people here aren't having fun, then how are we supposed to make games that are fun?
Jordan, if you recognize
The thing
him.
that makes Volition is the people, nothing else.
Ultimately, Volition has a lot of talent, and we're all self-made.
There's gurus and all sorts of stuff, like really like the top end kind of guys. They work. We like to call them like discipline, like the gods.
The studio's been in place over 18 years. We still have people here who were there when it started.
When you take the most talented people and you put them all together, they make badass games that people want to play.
So that's what's inspiring. So you get to work up that genius level, and then you're like, you have to like step it up yourself. You're like, well, how am I going to be the genius to them?
So that's kind of a punchline about our games. Like Leonard, I tend to boogie through these, so please feel free to stop me at any time. One of the big problems we run into with games at Volition, however, is chaos. We ask players to use our vehicles. We ask them to use our superpowers. We ask them to do the cool things that you can do in Saints Row, but sometimes they'd rather shoot a stripper out of a cannon. And that's something they can really do. And so unfortunately, one of the problems we've had over the years is when testing open world games, particularly for fun, that scary thing we're all chasing, and also for usability and usability problems, how do we get the players not to shoot the strippers out of a cannon, but actually to use the mechanics that we want them to use? So there's a two-pronged approach we take at Volition. The first is internal playtesting, and the second is through telemetry and data analysis. Internal playtesting is supported by 2 full-time staff, that's Jordan and Zelly, and an 8-person lab. It's primarily concerned with qualitative methodologies. They don't do a lot of the biometric stuff. They don't do a lot of the sort of investigative material that's a sort of mathematical quantitative. And they rapidly playtest and prototype little micro components of the games during the iteration. Telemetry and data analysis, on the other hand, is currently just me. It's an internal tool set we've built, and we use it to gather play data. This supports player research using a quantitative methodology. We also do some predictive analytics after release to see when players are most likely to purchase DLC, for example. This is our current setup. You can take a look up here. We have sort of a kind of living room approach, and there's a reason for that that I'll talk about in just a minute. It's been an iterative process, the kind of playtesting we've built at Volition. And this is not unlike the previous Ubisoft talk on a much, much, much smaller scale. We have about 200 people total, 250, as opposed to a billion. So we actually started a little bit on the first Red Faction titles, but we really formalized, this is sort of the recent tale of playtesting at Volition, with diary studies and player-heavy note-taking during Red Faction Armageddon. What this was players were asked to play, it's a traditional diary study, talk about issues they encountered, things they liked, things they didn't. We would iterate on that throughout the entirety of Red Faction Armageddon. We did deep tasks. This was the first way we decided to undertake our player research. You have to forgive me, I got a real stomachache, and I'm not sure what it is. I blame British food. Excuse me. Those deep tasks sort of involve like, all right, you're going to use only vehicles, and we're going to guide you through that process. And then we asked for diary studies about those vehicular manslaughters that the people would undertake. When we moved on to Saints Row the Third, we changed this approach just a little bit. We moved to makeshift playtest labs. We had no formal lab at this point. People were just occupying whatever conference room was free at that time. And we did kind of ethnographic studies at this point. We'd have one researcher at the time. This was Jordan, and for those of you who know Jordan, giving him power or any kind of leeway is a dangerous thing to do. For the 8 of you that get that joke, I'm sorry. These ethnographic studies took the form of observational recordings. We would simply watch the players with minor direction and record the kinds of things they were spending their time doing. This often took the form of literally timing them on different objectives. You know, they spent XYZ amount of time using vehicles, XYZ amount of time using superpowers, such and such an amount of time. For those of you who don't know the Saints Row games, they're open world games. The original one was sort of modeled, sort of directly modeled after Grand Theft Auto. And we sort of moved away from that over time to a more silly, open, freeform game, where we provide players with a huge amount of what are often called distractions. And the funny thing about a distraction is it makes for a very interesting research problem. We eventually settled on what we called explicit micro-tests, our second solution. We did this for Saints Row the Third. This is the kind of thing where we only gave you a level that had certain elements of the world enabled, or we would remove all NPCs, so then all you could do is drive. And we wanted to look at these little pieces of this giant open world puzzle independently of the world itself. But ultimately, we would later feel that that creates an artificial situation, because no matter how much good data we get supporting the players liked the superpowers or the fireballs or anything like that. Once we finished Saints Row 4, we have no real data about what they're really going to do in a real milieu of the millions of things that are available to them. Hookers, cannons, dildos, and all. I'll explain that. So by the time Saints Row 4, or Saints Row, we have the third, fourth, we have fun with this. We had a full-fledged lab at this point, and now we adopted an iterative design philosophy. Now we were going to test every feature from the ground up with a new approach, something we call the zoo. And I'll explain the zoo in a second here. This is kind of an example right here of that, and this is a generic screenshot. This is Red Faction Armageddon. We had kind of a pseudo-open world. It was a little bit linear. Players provided with distractions. We got them personally, not us, to take notes after their play sessions. So again, I'm not familiar with the thing Leonard was referencing with the pop-up interruption. We had to literally interrupt you, alt-tab to a word processor, huge diary study, and pull back to the game. Again, this isn't the best methodology. This was kind of, you're going back quite a ways here. And again, we don't really have the resources at our disposal. We like to be a small, scrappy studio. They pay me in trips to Europe and no actual money. There were a lot of diary studies here. So this obviously had some pros and cons. The major con here being that we had to go through all of these. So, if we had a few dozen playtesters come in, and from the local area, this is quite easy. We're blessed with 3 or 4 universities. We can get a pretty random sample. We bring people in, tell them they're going to be working on an unannounced title. We tell them we'll break their fingers if they say anything about it and pay them a small stipend. We have a lovely pool of a very varied audience to take samples from. This was a deep investigational method, we've called it, instead of a wide investigational method. We moved on to Saints Row 2, Saints Row the Third. This is character customization, if you wonder. We have a pretty eclectic group of fans. We changed this methodology. So one of the things, for example, and the reason I use this was our slide, that we tested extensively because we wanted it to be a core feature of Saints Row the Third was our customization option. This would later, in our Metacritic reviews and in our sort of post-release reviews, come out as one of our best features. So this really kind of validated that we needed to be testing early and often, as you've heard. This was a micro test where we simply only allowed people access to the customization. So as I said, micro tests. This is where we began to experiment with the open world by removing features, no vehicles this time, no superpowers this time, no gang members this time, and then put people out into the open world to go ahead and traverse it. What we now do is something we call the zoo. So we create the most, and this is based on an old Alan Thorndike theory, identical elements. We try our best to create the most similar environment for our players to actually play their games in an environment that they would play themselves. We like people to bring friends, we give them pop, soda, pop, I don't know what it is over here, the fizzy garbage. And we put them in a room with plants and couches and music and computers they're free to use, and we don't take their cell phones. We try to make this a place they would really play. And what we've been doing now is cross-referencing this using time-stamped recordings of their data. So we're recording what they're doing, we're taking observational notes as researchers through a streaming system, and we're time-stamping and recording all of that into a database that we can review at a different time. So at this point, if we want to review simply the vehicles, we isolate randomly periods of time that random playtesters, were using vehicles, swap that through randomly, and then only use these sections as a representative sample of the total player group within a real play session. Does that make sense? Essentially, I watch 50 people all day, and if I'm interested only in what it's like when people use the bathroom, I just snip out the portions where they were using the restroom, shuffle them randomly, select randomly from them. So, this is one of the ways we currently accomplish our tasks. So, it's more Franz de Wolf and less Jane Goodall, plus dick bats. So, my God, nobody is laughing at the dick bat. You people just have no potty humor. All right, fine. So, for those of you who don't know about Volition, this is one of our most iconic items, and there is a life-size one in the office that comes out during the Christmas parties. Is he joking? All right. So, removing chaos from our playtest is impossible, and we had a really terrible time trying to isolate little pieces of our game for testing. When we said you're only getting to use the vehicles, this felt like a restriction to players. They immediately were geared toward, we're putting chains on your ankles. You can't do anything but use the vehicles, especially when we only said you can't and didn't really isolate them from the world. They felt awful. They're like, I don't want to use these vehicles, even if they're amazing. They don't want to touch them. You've told them they can't do something, how they're going to go do it. This is why I'm in favor of a 2-year-old drinking age. But regardless, when you tell someone they can't do something, as I'm sure you're well aware, they are eager to do it. So, attempting to mitigate this sort of behavior, and up here you have the dubstep gun with a breakdancing Obama lookalike in the front. Attempting to stop them from using these things gave us mixed results. We really did see that players were frustrated and angry and upset, and we got consistently negative reviews, and after the fact, when we simply said, do whatever you want, these same features that they were previously reviewing as terrible, they started reviewing as wonderful. So paradoxically, this was kind of an observer effect, right? And we kind of moved that out of the equation. So to conclude that section, we do currently use a methodology where we simply basically let players do whatever the hell they want within an observed and controlled space. And using a huge amount of back-end data collection tools, slice out the pieces that we need. Now, up until recently, that was only for qualitative analysis. I would pull out video files, audio recordings, face recordings, and field notes at random. Then they hired me. Yes. Take that, student loans. So the first iteration was in Red Faction Armageddon. This is an older game now, I say 2010, thereabouts. We had a system we called GDS, Game Development System Support, or something like that. Anyway, it was a business analytics solution. This was not designed for the purpose of telemetry at all. This was a back-end system that was event-driven, so in the code, for those of you who program at all, you could simply throw a little method that was like GDS event and then name the event. It would toss out some data, and you'd be able to track that after the fact. So this allowed us to gather things like DLC purchases, whether someone had pirated the game or not, certain unlocks and things like that. So this gave us some very high-level telemetry, but it was really bad. It was originally completely never meant to support this kind of thing. And we would eventually develop it a little more robust, some more robust hooks in Saints Row the Third, and eventually we would hire someone dedicated to this role for Saints Row 4 and onward. And I'll discuss that in just a second here. So, I must apologize, I forgot to remove something. We have a little internal, and I apologize to anyone who's at Blizzard in the audience. But all of our internal stuff we jokingly will occasionally call by a Blizzard nickname. And it's just because we all play StarCraft in our free time. Great game, by the way. So, yeah, so Vespine is up here. That's not the real name. Red Faction Armageddon's GDS system did positional data. So what you have here is positional data from a map in Red Faction Armageddon and some basic heat mapping. Like this is where people were dying. And so this is filtered by hundreds. So this should give you an idea that this area right here is a big fucking problem. And it was. When we would investigate that area after the fact, we saw just piles of bodies, and this actually was a, believe it or not, a topography problem. People couldn't get over a hill fast enough before getting shot to death. And so a little level design change fixed this out. But this was one of our very first times using telemetry in a way that allowed us to take a look and say, oh, hey, something's wrong, we can probably fix it with a minor change. Saints Row the Third, we had much more robust data collection at this point. When we realized that the GDS system could collect data on any method called by our engine, we started writing in methods for everything. Shots fired, enemies killed, and unfortunately this is what I call the snatch and grab methodology. So an experienced thief, when breaking into a house, only takes the real gems, whereas someone robbing a convenience store takes everything. We were robbing a convenience store here. So unfortunately, some of our back-end events were so big that they would crush our server at certain times because we were gathering like a breadcrumb for every player every 5 seconds. So you're talking 20 million players, 5 seconds. This 10 kilobyte data file, we were getting like a big 20 megabyte heartbeat every millisecond. That's not good. So this was the smash and grab approach, but it did give us a lot of great, rich telemetry data to let us make insights about the kinds of things people were doing in the Saints Row game. And we would further develop this for Saints Row 4. But what we have here, by the way, is what we like to call the attrition curve. So this is completion of missions by player by time. You see this curve right here? That's pretty much present across every game I, in my non-Volition life and in my Volition life, have ever looked at. This is attrition. Launch days right here. Here's where all the people have tried your game, rented it, pirated it, and they're done with it. So our mission usually is to not only slow this down, but also keep this running average as high as possible. So that this is a pretty quick way to visualize some of the ways that this data can be useful to you. Here's a death map, by the way. This is one of the other lovely things we were able to do because of positional tracking. that allows us to visualize really quickly where players are spending their time. This is just a heat, death, and kills map for Saints Row the Third, aggregated by number of actions taken. So some of this makes good sense. You know, there are missions occurring. By the way, all these weird floating ones are because we did a little trick where if you were in a building or whatever and that building wasn't on the map, we just threw you in the middle of the ocean. So, I'm giving away the baby with the bathwater here. But these make sense. This was our big surprise. People spent hours just standing here. And if you've ever played Saints Row 3 and you're familiar with it, you'll know exactly where this is. It's right in front of your apartment on that big bridge. People would spend a really long time here just grinding out dead policemen. I mean a long time. So consequently, this really blew our mind. We thought this was something we only did. So these are the kind of data insights that they kind of were interested in developing further. So by the time Saints Row 4 came around, we had much more robust stuff. We captured literally everything that people were doing. This is order of store choices by time spent in the store, by purchase, most popular customization options, least popular customization options. We were capturing as much as we possibly could. But we've gotten to a point here by the end of Saints Row 4 where the data was getting so big and unwieldy that it was taking us hours to analyze anything meaningful out of it. And this again was because we had a great player research team now, 3 people strong, which is big for a 200-person studio. 8 computers running constant weekly playtests with strangers for the entirety of the development cycle. But our telemetry had very much until that point been very smash and grab. This was extra time stuff that the player research team was doing, extra time that some of the programmers were doing. There's no dedicated people involved. Enter me, and we started working on this. And now we have our old system compared on the left, and please ignore the Vespine. I really was supposed to take that out of there. I'm probably going to be fired when I go home. With what we're doing now. So on the left, this is our GDS system. So this was a client-side system. So your Xbox was gathering this all, or PlayStation or PC, whatever, or your pirated Chinese Android console, would gather all the data on the client side and shove it to us in a heartbeat. So you'd get a heartbeat every so often, and it would be pushed to our servers. It was slow to update, and it wrote directly to an SQL server. So what that meant was, first of all, it caused a huge performance issue, because writing to SQL directly is a little slow and can cause some data corruption. And on top of that, the sampling rate was predetermined. So if I wanted more granular data, less granular data, I couldn't switch that without entirely recompiling the exe. And that's not possible when I've already sold it to you, unless you want a 30 gig update file every couple of days. And players get really pissy when you're pushing 10 gig updates every day. So consequently, we had to come up with a better solution, hence our new one, which we're calling GAT, by the way, Game Analytics and Telemetry, nicknamed after one of our popular characters. Server-side. This is completely server-side. Your console is constantly emitting an event stream, and I can listen or not listen as I choose. I don't have to constantly queue. So this is something that allows us to say, hey, there's going to be a bajillion people playing this weekend because of a community event in Saints Row. You know, it's like, oh, hey, this is when we just released, for example, the Saints Save Christmas DLC on Saints 4. By the way, you should go buy 5 copies, everyone. Once that's been released, we know that we're going to see a surge in players, so we can turn down the sampling rate so we don't get that big server chunk this time around. It also dumps a wad of raw, unformatted, ugly JSON now. So this is uglier, but also is less resource intensive and allows us to pull it in and do stuff with it as we need. So there's a 3-part system that we now have that collects, preprocesses, and then allows for analysis of data. The collection is, of course, the JSON dump. We have an intermediate preprocessing program right now that just looks like, you ever see Engineer UI, where there's a million buttons on one program? Well, that's what it currently looks like, but we'll have a nice pretty one to show you next year, I hope. And that preprocesses data and then puts it out into whatever format you so choose. I can export to CSV, SQL, whatever, and run my tabulations and my heat maps and deliver those to the relevant parties. It's real-time-ish, meaning there's about a 3-second delay between the time someone's playing Saints Row and we see the data, and we can squelch or change based on server needs, which lets us do more science, as I say. And the punchline about this is, this meant that as soon as I hit the ground working at Volition, I was able to say, hey, superhero power designer that was wondering about the stomp. You asked me, what the average radius of impact was last week and if it was overpowered, and now here's real data to support whether that's the case or not. And I can do that quickly and easily and fast. And so this back-end stuff has been a really huge benefit for us, and it's completely made in-house. So I'm going to move on for a second here to give you a, this is actually going to allow us, and please replace that with GAT. This is eventually going to allow us next year to not only take much larger samples, but to disseminate information about play in real time inside the studio. We're big proponents of streaming, so every time there's a playtest at Volition, we stream the entire playtest to the whole studio. So everybody in the studio, anywhere, can even VPN, and click our Playtest Live button, see the PCs that are being streamed, listen to the audio, squelch, look at whatever screen they want, drill down a little bit, they can look at a real-time feed of events. And this allows them to get an idea. Suppose I'm a combat designer who's really interested in the flight in Saints Row GAD. And I want to see if people are using the sort of death from above, pew, 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 pew. So when we get to that point in the game, I, as that combat designer from my desk, can simply drill into the playtest and take a look and see a real-time output. We're eventually going to be able, hopefully, to give people real analytic predictive stuff coming out of there. We're not there yet. Here is a sample output, by the way. This is just the raw JSON that gets spit out of the thing. And that, by the way, is only there for illustrative purposes because it's probably completely meaningless to you. But it does spew out that kind of feed, which I then format into something that can be used by a standard data processing program. Tableau, your own Python solutions, whatever you might use. So what I want to kind of demonstrate, though, is the back and forth here between quantitative, qualitative methodologies. Our playtesting at Volition informed how we designed our telemetry. We knew we were going to use this kind of zoo because that's sort of the established way we playtest at Volition. And we knew we'd be analyzing player behavior after the fact as kind of like the biggest portion of what we were doing. So with the telemetry, I was able to get a little more data out of them without ever asking. And that's kind of the big thing at Volition. We really don't want you to be disturbed. We don't want to stick a cap on your head. I'm not trying to poop on you, Leonard, wherever you are. It's just we really do want this to be your living room. And I don't often sit with a giant rubber cap on my head in my living room. Saints Row besides. Now, the reason I say this is because for us, and only in our experience, and this is by no means scientific, but just for the sort of spirit of how we collect data, this was important to us. So when I said, hey, I want to do biometric stuff with a little Arduino, they were very about that, as long as I'm able to hide it inside of headphones, or hide it inside of the controller, or hide it in the couch. I will never get approval at my workplace to stick a person full of probes. So for that reason, we put as many telemetry hooks into the game as we possibly could so that when we're playtesting this actively, after the fact, if Jordan or another one of our researchers is very curious about something, I can take that spot, drill down easily with our system, and pull it out. And the other thing that's important to note is that we can't control the chaos on the telemetry either. So what I mean by that is, if I'm interested in average vehicle usage, for example, it's invariable that I'm also going to get number of strippers shot out of cannons. That's part of the data that's collected. And so we don't bother. We simply slice it post hoc exactly as we did with the qualitative stuff. Quick takeaways from this, by the way. If there were easy things for you, if you happen to be playtesting an open world, chaotic, crazy game with distractions, Ubisoft folks. I suppose it's kind of bold of me to give advice to Ubisoft guys, but don't lead players by the hand. An open world game is designed to be fun, distracting, enveloping, and engaging. It's supposed to give the players the ability to wander and do stupid things, hit people with giant purple penises. You want the players to get lost, and you want them to find that crazy stuff that you've spent all that time embedding in there. So let them. Create an environment where it's both possible, it's encouraged, and slice the data out after, especially if you have not only the human resources power, but also the computational power to do so. Data triangulation when you're doing this is so necessary. If you're not using some mix of quant and qual here, you are invariably going to miss something. We find so many of our funny things to investigate from quantitative investigation way after the fact. We look at number of deaths per mission, and we say, there's something really wrong here that nobody ever reported to us. Do the legwork. So our first mistake at the studio was making the players take all the notes. We made the players do all the notes, we made them log their own hours, that created a really artificial experience for our players, and we noticed really quickly as the days went on that the quality of work not only diminished, but also turned to really negative comments. People get irritated as soon as it becomes fun. I used to teach game design for a little bit, and I would always tell my students that video games are like sausage, which is a stupid analogy. Bear with me. It's not a dildo joke this time. It's kind of like very easy to eat, right? Like it's good, it's tasty. And so you might really think you like it until you see how it's made. And then suddenly you might not like it so much anymore. So when we forced the players to do the work and realized that they were actively part of a testing of a development environment, we pulled the curtain away from the wizard. And a lot of the magic, air quotes, was kind of lost there. This sounds really touchy-feely for a research conference, but honestly, you can tack, if you do even just like thematic analysis, the number of negative words that show up day by day by day. So, that's all I have. I hope I haven't bored you to death. I'm wandering up here because I'm telling you too much bangers and mash, but that's all. If you have questions, I'll be happy to address them. And hey, I was only 3 minutes over time.
So, time for a few questions.
So, your talk was specifically about chaos and managing chaos. Is there some kind of required level of chaos? Is that something you measure for?
So, ours is being a smaller studio. We have to be very reactionary in the sense that when, suppose we bring players in to test like a new traversal system, like with GAT here on the screen, we introduced your ability to fly. And that completely changed the dynamic of how you traverse a typical Saints Row city. And so we got some very interesting stuff players were doing. For example, completely bypassing our story missions to just fly around. I would call chaos anytime you don't have a crit path. I mean, we all have some crit path, but you don't have a linear crit path. So it's very easy if you were playtesting, say, Super Meat Boy, to slice that into levels that you're interested in getting the experience for, right? Like you can slice that really meaningfully without it being too obvious what you're omitting from the player's experience. With Saints Row, when we would lock you to an island, we were burdened by the fact that you could see the other islands. You were a fishbowl fish aware of the bowl. And that created a really artificial and really frustrating experience for a lot of our players. So, to answer your question, not to dodge it completely, no, I don't think so. I think when you don't have an easy way to slice your your game down into levels, like really discrete, compartmentalized pieces, this methodology can kind of be applied. We've used this sort of zoo thing for quite a while now with pretty good results. Sometimes, one of the things you do have to face though, and this is kind of a big negative that I hope somebody points out, is that sometimes you don't get the data you need. Like you have to accept that if you bring in 8 players for a day for $50, whatever, I don't know what we actually pay them, I pulled that out of my butt, but that they might not do what you want them to do. It's entirely possible that you'll have to shelf all that data and then later look it up for when you're interested in the stripper cannon, for example. Because it's entirely possible you will get that kind of stuff. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Florian from Ubisoft.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. From what you have told, you are never doing micro tests anymore? Okay, because my question was, when you have some very specific question, like does the player like to drive the vehicle, but does he manage to drive the vehicle? So as I said before, my first question was, are you sure that the player will drive the vehicle, and will you have enough data? My second question would be, do you organize a test session with this specific question in mind, and you're watching the stream, and you wait from the player to drive the vehicle, and you're like, okay, he has done it, check.
Sure. Okay, so I'll try to get both of those for you. First, we have not completely abandoned the micro test. There is one situation, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to dodge this question a little for reasons I can't explain, but I'm going to dodge it a little bit. But we do, I'm Canadian by the way, the apologies are just going to keep flooding out of my mouth. You know what's funny? I didn't hear John apologize once. Not once, wherever he is. Anyway, it's French Canadians, sorry. Anyway, so we do some micro testing, and it's in early development. So if we have Saints Row GAT, I'm dodging again, I'm sorry. If we're doing Saints Row GAT, and we're in a point where all we have at this point is an empty city, and we're really interested in how the player traverses hell. So the logical order of how the programmers have dictated to us that the game is going to be developed, or producers for that matter, is city, traversal, NPCs, vehicles, missions. Suppose that's kind of our milestone layout. We will do smaller tests on those individual pieces as they're developed. So we have this early and often methodology. You know, even if we were just at icons and concept art for GAT, we would be testing that. Even if it's reaction studies, like which of these images for GAT do you like better, and we'll be recording. And so we do early in development for GAT, for Saints Row 4, little micro tests. But as the game becomes more of an open world, city-based Volition game, we do remove those shackles bit by bit by bit. So we're always trying to give people the biggest test possible. So for example, once we have both the combat and the traversal in, we don't isolate them anymore. We would have already done that naturally in the production cycle, but we're not going to try to pull them out anymore past that point. To the second question.
It was more, how do you isolate after the session? You want to isolate all the driving session? How do you do that?
So the telemetry helps a lot. And what it lets us do is, there's just like simple flags. For example, like is driving. We'll take and then there'll be got out of car. So all of the way our telemetry system works, sorry if this is weird, but if you look at like this slide, these are all organized by epoch time. So that's like Unix time to the millisecond. So it's like, what, a number of milliseconds since 1969, December 31st, something like that. So it's an upward counting number that we know we can turn into with a simple calculation real time. So the processor, the middleman that I can't show you yet because it's still being built, will crunch stuff based on what we're interested in. So for example, if I was like, is driving plus or minus 3 minutes? It'll capture every event and every associated moment I have for a given playtest plus or minus a certain amount of time that the player was using a vehicle. And then I can associate that with video files, pull it down, and look at just this piece. Does that make sense?
It's impressive.
We try. Thank you. But like all things we make, we are shooting from the hip a little bit. So there is some... The good way to think of it is that I'm a daring rogue. The bad way to think of it is I'm a lazy asshole. But we are trying our best to make sure we get really good data despite all of that chaos. But it is a good question. The isolation is mostly done pointedly through timestamp collection of different events that we track. So I'll just cut out a piece of data and put it in a big lot, shuffle it, investigate it randomly. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I've got 2 questions. You can pick one or both, depending
Sure.
which one you think is interesting or not.
I'm not charging by the minute.
Yeah, easy. Do you do any A/B testing? That's question 1. And question 2 is about the user interface to the analytics system. I mean, one dreadful problem a lot of in-house systems have is that it's like, oh, the interface is actually a programmer, and that's limiting in some ways.
Sure.
How do you approach that?
Okay. So answer 1, A/B testing, kind of. So since we're doing constant playtests and they are time-stamped, if we discover in GAT, for example, that Celia back there gave a lovely talk about too much red in games, like it's very easy to get like, oh God, there's so much red, what do I look at? That's kind of a problem we encountered in, hell, where everything is rather red and orange. So if we make a recommendation that, hey, there's too much red here, we know when we made that recommendation, we log an event, and then the next playtest that come after it, where the fix happened, we simply look at the before and the after in the telemetry and data collection and see if there was any change. And if there wasn't, we recommend another change. Designers and programmers can be snowflakes about the things they make. So when you come to them and tell them that they need to continue changing, they're very likely to give you a string of expletives rather than actually fix it. So we like to wait until the playtest really has like a nice, here's the errors they made flying into buildings before and after you made that red change that I asked for. And then I can say, great job, instead of saying your shit's broke. So we do some in that sense, like before and after changes are made, but no explicit randomly assort playtests for trial A, trial B, compare. We don't do it in that sort of methodology.
Yeah, the girl in roller skates comes and gives you a free drink.
Right,
or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So to your second question, the interface for our processor. So the back end is always going to be an event spew. So it's always going to be just this ugly JSON gross. It's not meant to be human readable. It's meant to be back-end readable, and then I kind of stick my hand in and pull out what I need. That processing portion is the portion that needs the nice interface. Right now, it's literally a Unix command line, so that's not a nice interface at all. We'll get there, but it works at the moment, and those that are kind of internal, just whack that one. Those that are internal and trained on it can use it really well, really fast. It's definitely not something we intend to put out publicly, so.
It's a thing for the list.
What's that?
A thing for the list.
Yeah, it's somewhere down the bottom, but it is there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Since if you don't lead the player by the hand and you kind of turn away from micro-testing as soon as you have a game that's solid enough to have the feature altogether, don't you end up with a huge gap in in your data collection? I'm thinking about endgame, for example, especially on a game like Saints Row, when you have content that can be unlocked after dozens and dozens of hours. If the player just roam around and do whatever they want, what do you do? Do you keep those gap in your data and say that if the player don't use them that much in test, it is not a big deal on release? Or are you trying to nudge them toward, without leading them, but nudge them toward that to get answers?
So, without saying we do bad science, we do a little bit of bad science. And what I mean by that is, we will, and you're right, necessarily have more data by a long shot for the early missions, the customization, the early unlocks, and the earlier powers than we will for the end powers. Always. We do try to keep playtesters for a long time, for many days. So naturally, many of the players, and we select them pseudo-randomly, so I mean, some of them aren't great at the game, so they don't necessarily ever get to the end. But many of our players do get, so I guess Saints Row 4 realistically takes probably 40 hours to complete, give or take. So if we're bringing in for 2 weeks, which we will do occasionally, you're going to complete the game. 8 hours a day, you're gonna complete it. We do try to keep that maximum kind of low, though, because there is some kind of it becomes work element, like the thing I mentioned before. But we will extrapolate. List-wise insertion or stochastic insertion, occasionally we'll kind of take interpolated data, for example, if we're looking for it. And we start outlier seeking toward the end. So, for example, if 4 people died spectacularly out of 10 on the endgame mission, we would consider that way more significant than if 4 people died spectacularly out of 100 in the early stuff, even though it could just be noise. So we do kind of do some p-value be damned, shoot from the hip science. And that is unfortunately one of the realities of a 200-person studio. I would love to tell you that I just have thousands of people that come in and we have such a huge amount of data that that's not even a problem. That's not reality, though, I'm afraid. Which has been one of my most jarring changes from academia to industry. For example, when I first arrived, I'd be like, here's the average number of deaths and the standard deviation. And most people's response was, what is standard deviation? And I said, okay, I'm not gonna put that on the paper anymore. Don't worry about it. It's math, voodoo, don't worry about it. So we do some bad science occasionally. I mean, that's not meant to be an admission of guilt, but rather a reality of production, sadly. Someday I hope to say we don't do that anymore. I hope that answers the question, doesn't just avoid it.
No, that's okay.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi there. Have you tried any clustering analysis to sort of group players into behavior subsets?
Yes. So we have only on the most recent title done any really crunchy quantitative data collection. So they're preliminary enough that I would be a little uncomfortable showing you them right yet. But yes, we do have, Saints Row games are notorious for having a huge amount of inane collectibles, for those of you who have played them, to the point that in our Christmas DLC, anybody play the Christmas DLC? Anybody at all? All right, at least one of you. So there's a moment where you, like an old cartoon from the 20s, Jack Frost, have to lick your way out of prison because the prison bars are candy canes. And it takes 25 minutes of mashing the A button without stopping to get through these candy canes, during which time the NPC characters will loudly make fun of you for tapping the A button. It's like, don't you have to use the bathroom? Like, it will actively make fun of you. But we have people who did that overwhelmingly. Something like 40-50% of our total players spent the 25 minutes pushing A. So we are very aware of kind of who our achievers are, who our wanderers are, and who our cooperators are. They're kind of like three that we work with: explorers, achievers, cooperators. But it's preliminary and not.
Are you using k-means, or is it what kind of method are you using? What kind of methodology?
I'm sorry?
What kind of methodology are you using for your cluster
This is just
analysis?
like k-means clustering algorithms. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And do you find that the playstyles change over time? And do you, if so, do you account for that?
Yeah, so there's definitely, and again, this is one that I'm not super confident in, but it looks like we have kind of like early exploration, late achievement. Does that make sense? So even the players who would be predisposed that we already know from our database that we have like notes on, that would be the people who are going to get every single collectible, they don't seem to start that behavior until they've already been playing for 5 or 6 hours, give or take. But again, I am eyeballing this, but it is a good question and we are doing it. It's just, there's also, and this is a bar conversation. I have mixed feelings about the validity and usefulness of the clustering algorithms and not just the algorithms mathematically, but their application to players. Anyway, that's a bar conversation. I hope I didn't dodge your question.
No, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Last question, perhaps? Short one? No? Anyone? Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.